chairs in Washington usually collapse under mountains of paper. Thick binders dropped onto committee desks. Secret recordings leaked to cable news. Anonymous officials sprinting toward cameras with explosive revelations they somehow waited years to reveal. That is the normal ritual of political scandal in America. Loud headlines, manufactured outrage, a week of panic followed by collective amnesia. But what happened to Pam Bondi began differently. Her credibility did not crack under a massive investigation. It started collapsing because of one ordinary government document sitting inside a thin folder held by Ted Lieu. One page from an FBI access log. That was enough, because this was never really about politics. It only looked political from a distance. Once the hearing moved past the television theatrics and into the timestamps, the access records, the authentication history, the sequence of file views, the atmosphere inside the chamber changed into something much colder. This stopped feeling like congressional theater and started feeling like a cross-examination where one side already knew the answer before the question was asked. And Ted Lieu understood exactly how to build that kind of pressure. Before entering Congress, Ted Lieu spent years inside the United States Air Force Judge Advocate General's Corps as a military prosecutor. That detail matters because prosecutors trained in military courts learn something most politicians never understand. Witnesses rarely destroy themselves through dramatic confession. Most destroy themselves through tiny contradictions repeated too many times under controlled pressure. One inaccurate sentence. One timeline that does not fit. One statement that quietly collides with a machine-generated record nobody expected to surface. Pam Bondi walked into that hearing believing she could survive through discipline. For hours, she repeated the same carefully engineered responses. I reviewed summaries. I did not examine the full files. I was not familiar with those specific details. Different senators asked different versions of the same question, and every answer followed the same defensive architecture. Calm tone, limited exposure, strategic vagueness. The kind of language designed to reduce legal risk while sounding cooperative enough for television audiences. Then, Ted Lieu opened the folder. According to reporters inside the hearing room, Bondi visibly relaxed when she first saw how thin it was. That reaction tells you everything about the psychology of witnesses under pressure. Large stacks of documents create fear because they suggest unknown exposure. A single document creates confidence. People assume limited paperwork means limited danger. Prosecutors know this. Good prosecutors use it. Ted Lieu removed one page and placed it on the desk. March 14, 2016. FBI Access Authorization Request. Florida Attorney General's Office. Authorized signature, Pam Bondi. Requested material, Jeffrey Epstein master file. Access level, full authorization approved. The room shifted almost immediately. Staffers behind senators stopped whispering. Journalists leaned forward instead of typing. One cable producer later described the moment as the point where everyone realized the hearing had moved beyond politics and into evidentiary territory. Because suddenly the issue was no longer whether Pam Bondi remembered details correctly. The issue became whether her previous testimony could survive contact with federal system records, and the records were brutally specific. The FBI logs showed nearly 2 hours and 47 minutes of activity inside the Epstein master file. The system tracked page sequence, viewing duration, authentication events, and sub-document access history. 12 minutes spent on general summaries. 47 minutes reviewing the complete name list. 34 minutes inside invitation records and witness statements. 28 minutes examining the Trump-Epstein timeline. This was not secondhand exposure to briefing material. According to the FBI's own digital records, Pam Bondi had direct access to the full investigative file. And here is where the hearing became genuinely dangerous for Pam Bondi, because federal access logs are not casual administrative paperwork. They are forensic records. Every movement inside those systems is tracked automatically at the sub-document level. Which page was opened, how long it remained active, whether material was flagged, copied, expanded, or revisited. Federal case management software is built with the assumption that one day those records may need to survive courtroom scrutiny. In other words, Ted Lieu was not presenting interpretation. He was presenting machine memory. And machine memory is difficult to argue with. Pam Bondi tried anyway. She leaned toward the microphone and attempted to characterize the request as routine coordination. That phrase sounded reasonable for about 3 seconds until Ted Lieu introduced the next detail into the record. Between 2011 and 2019, Bondi's office had submitted only 8 requests for full FBI master file access during her tenure as Florida Attorney General. 8 total, roughly 1 per year. The Epstein investigation was one of them. That destroyed the word routine, because ordinary coordination does not involve nearly 3 hours inside one of the most politically radioactive investigative files in modern America. Ordinary coordination does not involve extended review of invitation records, witness statements, and a dedicated Trump-Epstein chronology. The numbers themselves started building a kind of prosecutorial gravity inside the room. 47 minutes on the complete name list. 34 minutes on invitation records and witness statements. 28 minutes specifically tied to the Trump-Epstein timeline. At that point, the hearing stopped revolving around what Pam Bondi claimed she remembered. The hearing became about what the timestamps proved she saw. And this is where the timeline matters more than most people initially realized. March 14, 2016 was not some random administrative date floating in isolation. That request landed during a period when renewed legal pressure surrounding Jeffrey Epstein was beginning to build again in federal court. Questions surrounding the 2008 non-prosecution agreement were re-entering public scrutiny. Federal judges in Florida were considering document exposure tied to the earlier investigation. In plain English, the Epstein case was becoming politically dangerous again at exactly the same moment Pam Bondi requested full access to the FBI master file. That coincidence became increasingly difficult to dismiss. Then Ted Lieu did something experienced prosecutors often do when they know the evidence has already cornered the witness. He simplified the language. No long speeches, no dramatic performance. He lowered the complexity because complexity was no longer necessary. "Miss Bondi," he said calmly, "multiple members of this committee asked whether you reviewed the underlying Epstein files. Each time, your answer was that you only reviewed summaries. Is that your testimony today?" Bondi answered carefully. "Yes, I reviewed summaries, not the complete files." The sentence barely had time to settle before Ted Lieu lifted the access record again. The FBI system logs show nearly 2 hours and 47 minutes of direct activity inside the Epstein master file. Then he started reading. 12 minutes on summary materials. That part helped Bondi. Then came the rest. 47 minutes on the complete name index. 34 minutes on invitation records and witness statements. 28 minutes on the Trump-Epstein chronology. Now notice what happened psychologically inside the room. Nobody interrupted him. Nobody objected. Even the chairman hesitated because everyone understood the danger of interrupting a witness while federal records were being read line by line into the congressional record. The silence itself became part of the pressure. Pam Bondi's lawyers were no longer listening like political advisors calculating media optics. According to journalists seated near the defense table, they had started scanning the documents with the expression of people searching for procedural escape routes that did not exist. Because if the logs were authentic, and nobody challenged their authenticity, then the contradiction was no longer rhetorical. It was evidentiary. And that was the moment Ted Lieu stopped arguing about documents and started building a trap around a single unanswered question. Good prosecutors understand something politicians usually do not. Facts alone rarely create pressure. Pressure comes from forcing someone to choose between incompatible answers. The most dangerous courtroom questions are not complicated questions. They are simple questions sitting at the intersection of conflicting realities. Every possible response carries a cost. Pam Bondi was about to walk directly into one. Ted Lieu placed the access logs back onto the desk and paused for a moment. The room had become unusually still by then. Even people who did not fully understand the legal significance of the FBI records could sense the hearing changing shape in real time. This no longer sounded like a partisan exchange designed for social media clips. It sounded like somebody narrowing a corridor until only one exit remained. Then Ted Lieu spoke again. "Donald Trump attended events with Jeffrey Epstein," he said evenly. "Were underage victims present at any of those events?" That was it. No speech attached. No emotional buildup. No accusation wrapped around the question. Just one sentence dropped into the center of the hearing room like a live explosive. And suddenly every pathway in front of Pam Bondi became dangerous. Because by that stage of the hearing, the FBI access logs had already established several devastating facts. Pam Bondi had reviewed invitation records. She had reviewed witness statements. She had spent 28 minutes inside the Trump-Epstein chronology. The committee now possessed evidence that directly contradicted her earlier attempts to minimize her familiarity with the file, which meant the question Ted Lieu asked was no longer hypothetical. If Bondi answered no, she risked contradicting witness material she had already been documented reviewing. If she answered yes, she would effectively place a former president of the United States inside one of the darkest dimensions of the Epstein investigation during a televised congressional hearing. And if she attempted to retreat back into ignorance, the access log sitting inches away would immediately collapse that defense. 3 possible answers. 3 possible disasters. That is why the silence began. At first, it lasted only a few seconds, the kind of hesitation audiences normally ignore. But inside the room, people noticed immediately because experienced litigators recognize survival calculations when they see them. Bondi opened her mouth slightly, then stopped. Her eyes moved toward her legal team. One journalist later described the expression at the defense table as less political concern and more procedural alarm. The distinction matters. Political panic worries about headlines. Procedural panic worries about exposure. 10 seconds passed, then 20. Journalists who had spent most of the hearing typing nonstop into laptops began slowing down because the room no longer required transcription. It required observation. One producer from a national network reportedly told colleagues through an earpiece, "Stay on her face." Even television crews could feel that the hearing had crossed into territory where silence itself was becoming evidence. And here is the truly uncomfortable part of this story. Nobody rushed to rescue her. The committee chairman hesitated. Other senators remained quiet. Her lawyers did not interrupt. Because once a witness sits frozen between conflicting answers while federal records sit openly on the table, intervention becomes risky. Interrupt too quickly, and it looks protective. Interrupt too slowly, and the silence grows teeth. 30 seconds, then 40. Pam Bondi finally reached for a glass of water. Her hand was visibly unsteady. A small amount spilled across the table surface. Nobody commented on it publicly, but cameras caught it clearly enough that clips began circulating online within minutes. Not because spilled water matters politically, but because physical reactions expose what rehearsed language tries to conceal. And by then, the entire hearing room understood the real issue was no longer whether Pam Bondi had reviewed the Epstein files. The real issue was why someone with full access to those records suddenly could not produce a 2-letter answer in public. By the time the silence crossed the 1-minute mark, the hearing no longer belonged to Pam Bondi. It no longer even belonged to Ted Lieu. The moment had escaped both of them and entered a much more dangerous territory. Public perception shaped in real time by millions of people watching a government official appear physically unable to answer a direct question tied to underage victims and the Epstein investigation. And once that image enters public memory, it does not leave quietly. CNN began running live countdown graphics. MSNBC reportedly kept the camera fixed almost entirely on Bondi's face. Even commentators normally skilled at filling airtime with non-stop analysis struggled because there was nothing left to interpret in that moment. The silence itself had become the story. Not partisan commentary, not legal nuance. Silence. 77 seconds. That number matters because ordinary hesitation lasts a few moments. 77 seconds inside a congressional hearing feels endless. It stretches unnaturally. The human brain starts searching for explanation because instinctively people understand that simple truths usually arrive quickly. When someone cannot answer a yes or no question for over a minute while staring at federal records documenting their prior knowledge, audiences begin drawing conclusions long before any legal process formally begins. That is exactly what made Ted Lieu's strategy so effective. He never needed to accuse Pam Bondi of protecting Donald Trump. He never needed to explicitly claim a cover-up. He simply constructed a logical environment where every possible answer carried consequences and then allowed the silence to expose the contradiction for him. Prosecutors call this closing the exits. Once every safe route disappears, witnesses often reveal more through hesitation than they ever would through speech. And then Ted Lieu delivered the final turn of the knife. He stopped looking at Bondi and began reading back her earlier testimony from throughout the hearing. At 9:23 a.m., she claimed no knowledge of invitation details connected to Trump and Epstein events. FBI logs showed 34 minutes reviewing invitation records and witness statements. At 10:47 a.m., she denied reviewing specifics tied to guest activity. The logs again showed direct access history. At 12:15 p.m., she claimed unfamiliarity with witness statements despite system records documenting prolonged review time on precisely those materials. One contradiction could be dismissed as confusion. 4 contradictions begin forming a pattern, and patterns matter in federal law. Because once inconsistent statements are connected directly to documentary evidence, the conversation moves away from politics and toward potential exposure under perjury statutes. That does not automatically mean charges. Ted Lieu understood that. Bondi's lawyers understood that. But congressional referrals do not require certainty of conviction. They require evidence substantial enough to force the Department of Justice to evaluate whether sworn testimony knowingly conflicted with documented records. That threshold suddenly looked very real. Now step back from the personalities for a moment because this story becomes much larger once you do. The most disturbing part of the hearing was never about one Republican, one Democrat, or even one former president. The disturbing part was watching how fragile public trust becomes when people in positions of extraordinary authority appear unable to answer basic factual questions under oath, despite documented access to the underlying evidence. Because ordinary Americans understand something instinctively. If a regular citizen sat in a deposition for 77 seconds after being confronted with contradictory electronic records, nobody would describe that as complicated optics. Nobody would issue polished press statements about politically motivated questioning. The system would move aggressively and immediately. That is the moral pressure hanging over this entire hearing. Do laws become flexible once power reaches a certain altitude? Or does accountability still exist above the level of television strategy and legal word games? That is the real question sitting underneath every second of Pam Bondi's silence. And unless somebody answers it clearly, the public will answer it themselves. If you watch this hearing all the way through, comment below with the moment you think the room realized the defense had collapsed. Like, share, and subscribe if you want more breakdowns that go beyond headlines and follow the evidence where it actually leads.